Hi everybody, Rachel Bodie Leffelholtz here, coming to present my 703 portfolio project for the MSM program at Franklin University. This is a project that I'll kind of hold near and dear to my heart for quite some time. Rural healthcare is pretty amazing, and I actually had the privilege of meeting this gentleman on several occasions, both as an RN in the emergency department and then as a family nurse practitioner student in the clinic. So my patient is an 86-year-old gentleman. His initials are ID, and he presents to me in the clinic for a transition of care visit. So he was admitted to UW Hospital for several days and then to a acute care rehab facility for several months following a subdural hematoma evacuation. A little history behind ID. He reportedly had a fall several weeks prior, causing him to hit his head on a concrete block. He was brought into the emergency room, and a head CT showed negative for bleed at that time, but he did have several lacerations that were repaired. He was noted to have some asymptomatic bradycardia in the 40s while he was resting. He was going to have an outpatient blood pressure monitor and Holter monitor placed and follow up with primary care. He was advised to follow up with his primary care on several days. However, he was unable to make it to his primary care appointment because he presented again to the ER with EMS after a fall in the bathroom, striking his head yet again and going unconscious. The CT showed a significant acute on subacute large subdural hematoma with a mass effect to the left and a small left acute subdural hematoma. He was then transferred to UW-Madison for a neurosurgery consult and definite treatment. So the fun part about this is I was one of the nurses working with him that day that he was med flighted. However, I didn't realize or make the correlation between this situation and this follow-up appointment because he was not my patient. I was just helping out with him that day in the ED. So I kind of grew I got the full circle of kind of what happened from the RN to the NP perspective. His stay at UW was complicated by an arrhythmia, thrombocytis, leukocytosis, DVT, pulmonary embolism. He required many consults, cardiology, hematology. A TEE revealed an ejection fraction of 40%, severely dilated atria. He had an event monitor placed that assessed his correlation with the syncope. For rate control, they did a loading dose of amiodarone, and he was sent home on that. Hematology was significant for JAK2 V617F mutation, indicative of a myeloproliferation neoplasm, which was also worked up. He was started on a heparin drip, transfused. He was started on anticoagulation, and then finally, when he was stable, he was discharged to an acute care facility where he spent several months before returning home after therapies were complete. Since returning home, he was doing fairly well. His strength and his function were improving slightly. He was sleeping in a recliner and having to use a pillow to elevate his feet. He was denying shortness of breath, palpitations, confusion, change in strength. His incision sites were wonderful, and his pain was adequate. He was using a walker and wearing a helmet when he was ambulating, and was receiving home health several days a week. He was followed outpatient by neurology, hematology, cardiology, and a repeat head CT was scheduled before the next neurology visit. During this transition of care follow-up, I thought everything was going really, really well. And then ID wrote down something on a piece of paper and kind of slipped it over to me. And I looked at it, and then I said, oh, yes, we can do that. So on the sheet of paper, it said, I have other concerns. My wife needs to go. So he presented to this transition of care visit with his daughter, WM, who was the active POA at the time, and then JD, his wife. So his wife suffers from severe dementia, and she was having more frequent violent outbursts towards him and his family. She'd frequently leave the stove on, leave candles burning. She was verbally and physically aggressive to their children, especially the daughter, and was just not meeting the needs that ID needed as far as medication management and just the support that he needed when the home health nurses were not there. ID recognized the deterioration in his wife's condition and wanted to discuss a few things so that if he were ever to have a situation again where he was unable to speak for himself, he wanted to make sure that the woman that he trusted, which was his daughter, WM, was in charge of all of his concerns. So with the ongoing threats of endangerment to the children, we had to make a decision to kind of break JD away from us in the exam room. So this is when I kind of walked out and kind of discussed with my preceptor, hey, this is what's going on, and we need to have a discussion because I don't think things went as well. But the wife can't be in the room because of the violent history, and she just needed to feel like she was in control of her husband. So the nurse was also gracious as to kind of escort her out of the room and say, hey, I have a lot of paperwork that needs to be filled out from Madison. Can you come and just fill this out? It needs to be filled out by the family, the wife. It needs to be filled out by the wife. So she was more than happy to be the only one that could fill out this paperwork while me and the provider went in to have this follow-up discussion. We said, we're just going to do a little physical exam, a little more paperwork for insurance stuff. So if you can work on that out there, the nurses will help you, and then we'll just finish up in here, and then you'll be good. The tension in this room when WM and JD were in the same room was very, very heavy. They had to actually sit at two separate corners because she was known at many times to just grab her cane and just beat WM with them, which was kind of scary because I also didn't want to end up getting hurt or getting in the middle of this situation. So ongoing threats were made. The ride to the office today was very hostile. ID's wife was the purpose of this conversation was originally brought up by the patient. So ID initiated this conversation. He was rather upset that when he was shipped to Madison the second time after the second ER visit, his point of contact or his emergency contact listed in the EMR at that time was JD. JD was also at the capacity where she was not able to function for herself, let alone make solid decisions for him. And most of those decisions that she did make while he was in the hospital were against ID's wishes. ID was very upset that JD made all those decisions while in the hospital and wanted to know what he could do so that he would make sure that his wishes were upheld and that his rock, his daughter WM, was the one to make those decisions. But he needed to make sure that his wife was not aware of the situation so that the violence didn't escalate. It was unknown to the staff that she suffered from dementia. When you talked to her on the phone, you talked to her in person, she, was able to converse and answer questions appropriately. However, she was not of sound mind due to her advancing dementia. And due to the COVID restrictions, all the interactions between the healthcare provider and the wife were made over the phone. This was definitely something that was difficult. The phone conversations made it seem like everything was fine. The wife was of sound mind, and when really she was not. And it was hard, and that was a part on a lot of people that we missed being able to pick up on that dementia because there was only one emergency contact listed. So consent for transport from Grant Regional UW was obtained from the wife because she was the only medical contact and the only contact able to reach that day when the emergent situation was made. He did not have an advance directive in his chart and would really like to make one now. listing his daughter WM as the POA. At some point during this transition, WM became the POA. I'm not quite sure how that all worked, but there was an emergency piece of paperwork in the EMR that listed her as the POA. It must have came from Finley. However, he wanted to make one that was more holistic and one that kind of spelled out his wishes so that they were written and not just placed on her shoulders. ID would like to make sure that all of his medical decisions were made entirely by his daughter and that his wife cannot overrule any of the decisions that she has made. So this is a very, very difficult conversation, very difficult conversation to have, especially when it was brought up by the patient after experiencing so many negatives and so many situations where if advance directive was present, it would have tremendously helped the patient and the family indefinitely. So with the time that we had this short amount of time to discuss as much as we could while JD was out of the office. We went over the 5 wishes document. So the first part of the 5 wishes document was really easy for JD or ID to figure out. He knew it was going to be his daughter. Their proxy was going to be WM. He actually stated that she is my rock and my ultimate decision maker, which kind of got everybody in the room a little teary-eyed, and it was just a hard, very high-strung emotional situation. He knew it was going to be WM. WM was there for him for everything and anything, took care of him despite the fact of the verbal abuse and the physical abuse that his wife, her mother, was giving to her. The patient knew that this was going to be what he wanted. He was very firm in his decision that WM would be his ultimate decision maker. And he was very stern and just matter of fact about it, that this is who I trust. This is my rock. She is my ultimate decision maker. The family member, so WM, kind of knew this conversation was going to be happening at today's visit. So she knew that she was going to officially be put in that place of the POA and to make decisions for her dad despite what her mom has said. They were not resistant to this conversation. It was very open and honest, and there was absolutely no barriers to starting this conversation. It was started by the patient themselves. So I did discuss, there was a little sheet. It was must have been an emergency authorization for a POA. However, there was no formal overview of what the patient actually wanted. It would just listed WM as the person and the point of contact for this patient at that time while he was in the acute care rehab. So the patient's goals, we went over the 5 parts of the 5 wishes. The second section had to deal with what he would want done, what decisions he would want done if he could not make decisions for himself, to write down what kinds of medical treatment he does or does not want. And ID, he's a rural farmer. He's an old, stubborn farmer. He looked up at me and he said, "I don't want you to ever shove that tube down my throat again. That is the worst sore throat I've ever had." And he just had to bring a little sarcastic light to a very dark conversation after discussing that he no longer wanted his wife to be his person. He wanted his daughter. So he wanted to make sure that the things that he wanted were written down. So this is where we discussed, we're in the 5 wishes document, that he can write down no intubation. We discussed code status. At that time, he said, "I do not want CPR. I do not want it." WM became very teary-eyed at this point and was kind of upset and looked at him and said, "Well, you've made it this far, Dad. Look at all you've come through." And This is where every dry eye in the room went south. And ID kind of looked over at her and said, "This is not the life I expected. And how can I live? How can I live knowing what's going on with Mom? This is not the way she wanted to live. This is not the way that I wanted to live. And I've been so close to going home." Exact words were, "This isn't the life I expected. How can I go on living with Mom the way she is when the good Lord wants me at home?" Very hard to keep a straight face without any tears. We went through a box of tissues at this appointment. So again, we filled out the DNR, Wisconsin DNR paperwork and submitted that to the EMR. Any of his other wishes, which would include the intubation, the IV medications, he basically wants no measures whatsoever at this point. He said if he falls over again and is found unconscious, that's it. Let him go. However, if it's something that could be surgically repaired, such as, a broken arm or a broken leg where he could recover from it without needing, life-saving medications or somebody breathing for him, he would be okay with it. Now that the emotions in this visit were very, very high, I was at the point where I wondered if we should maybe take a break and come back at another visit. Because there was a lot that we've already discussed and there was a lot more to discuss. However, ID said, "Nope, I want everything done and I want it done today," because of the dynamics of getting to the appointment and getting WM off work to sit and discuss all these things while his wife was occupied, so that she wasn't aware of the things that were happening and she couldn't say anything about them. He looked over at WM and joked, "Now pay attention. We aren't even halfway done, and you know how I forget things, so keep going." Tap on the table and said, "Keep going." So they laughed with teary eyes, and we moved on to the third wish, which was addressing the comfort and how comfortable he'd want to be with medications for nausea, complementary therapies, things like that. And again, the real stubborn farmer, he chuckled back and laughed, and he goes, "I ain't never had a massage in my life. Might as well get one before the good Lord takes me home. And make sure you play the good country music, the stuff that they play on Sunday morning, like John Denver, when I'm on my deathbed." Here he is, adding some light into a very dark conversation, but he knew what he wanted. He wanted to be comfortable. He was fine with pain medication for nausea. He wanted the massage if it was something that was going to be able to be offered. And he wanted to make sure that we didn't play any of that new country, that good stuff. Wish 4 would be how we'd want people to interact with you in the end of the life process. And this is where the conversation kind of flipped and got very, very serious again. And ID very seriously looked at me and said, "If JD, his wife, creates any smoke with my kids, I want her removed from the building. If I am critically ill or dying and she is causing issues with my children, I want her removed and I want my children there." This was kind of a side of ID that I haven't seen before, and neither did my preceptor. He was very stern and very genuine. But he knew that the wife that he had now is not the wife that he married with her dementia, and his kids were his number one. So he wanted to make sure that if he was dying, that his kids were there, and that his wife wasn't going to make that harder for them, make that process harder than it already had to be for them. He made another funny comment during this time, and I told him that he needed to be very specific with the instructions, and he shook his head and he said, "Oh, you bet I will." He said, "You ain't gonna talk shit to my baby girl on my deathbed." And WM just kind of shook her head and just you can't help but laugh. You got to know this man. He's genuine, loving, heartwarming, and just he's a family man, but he knew what he needed to do for his kids. I also reminded him that this is where he needs to put what dying means to you, how you would want to be remembered, in any funeral wishes. I asked if there was any questions that needed to be discussed because there's a lot of information. It was went over really, really quickly. ID denied questions and reported that he'd have this document filled out with me and back to me soon. I assured him that the clinic would be able to answer any questions that he needed if he got into this document. And he stopped and looked at me again and said, you know, when you spend as much time in the hospital, you really start thinking about what you want, what you don't want, how you want to live, how you want to die, how you want to be remembered, and who you want to be your person. Which just kind of just sat with me. He did spend a lot of time in the hospital, and he knew what he wanted. He knew what he didn't want, and he knew how he wanted his legacy to be remembered. I understood that a lot of important information was discussed during this encounter, and that the circumstances that surrounded this event needed to happen, and they needed to happen today, in case ID were to have another incident with his heart, or he would have a rebleed in his brain and he was unable to speak for himself, that this document was in place and it was available in the EMR so that the nursing staff like myself, who, were unable to find another point of contact, were aware that WM is the person, if he is unable to make decisions for himself, that is to make the decisions. And we are not to discuss any of those treatment options or things with his wife any further. His near fatal event and the dysfunction with his family dynamics brought to heart that this document needed to be completed so that he could be honored, and if he became ill again, he was able to trust that his wishes were honored. It was very clear that he spent a lot of time thinking about his wishes throughout his hospitalizations and his rehab, and he was motivated and determined to ensure that this document was returned and filed away. His durable power attorney for healthcare, like I stated, was WM. His life-saving treatments we did discuss. In regards to the palliative performance scale, I did rate his scale at 60%. So he did have a reduced ability to ambulate. He was using a walker, but still able to get around and do what he could. He was able to do some, but not all, of his hobbies and homework. And he occasionally needed assistance with things, mostly with hobbies and homework. His Korofsky scale, I rated at a 70%. He was caring for himself, but not to the full extent of normal activities. He needed significant help with the things around the farm and needed additional help with just daily activities, such as laundry. The laundry was something that he was not able to do. I do have an update on ID. So since I did see him in the office, I unfortunately got to see him again in the emergency room after another fall. He was brought in by EMS and had to be transferred due to a pelvic fracture. That afternoon, he was accompanied by WM, and this is really special. WM recognized me from the clinic and told me, that paperwork, you got that paperwork right. And I assured her, this time he was my primary patient, that yes, I do have, we went through this, I've got it, it's updated, you are it. However, ID was still able to talk and things for himself during this broken hip. He had no neurological deficits. He was of sound mind at that time. WM pulled me aside and said, I need to talk to you. Nearly 16 hours ago is when he fell. He fell in the middle of the night, and his wife was not able to create that correlation that he fell and he was injured and needed help. So she just left him lay there, just thinking he's just holding up the wall on the floor for 16 hours. So he had severe rhabdo. And he was not found until later that afternoon, when the daughter came to check on him. It was very interesting to see how the PCP addressed these concerns post-traumatic event, to correlate with like her mental illness. WM was at the point where she would like her mother placed in an assisted living, or I'm sorry, would like her father placed in an assisted living facility and her mother in a memory care unit if possible, just because of the fall and the decline in cognition of being able to, call for help. She wasn't able to recognize that he fell, he broke his leg, and she just let him sit there and suffer for 16 hours because she didn't know enough anymore that this is a problem, I need to call for help. I'm unsure when I'll ever see ID again, and I'm unsure of what happened with JD. I do know that they were trying to get her an appointment with her PCP to kind of correlate that mental health and safety, so that she could be appropriately placed and be in a safe environment where she's not at risk of hurting herself or hurting others. And ID, last time I checked, was still in rehab, doing fairly well, but was going to have a long road ahead of him, because it was actually a pretty significant fracture that he had. So with all that being said, it was a very, very emotional discussion. Very emotional discussion to have, and the circumstances that surrounded the event made it a little more emotional, especially when he had to kind of cut out his wife from his life, essentially, so that he could know his wishes were honored and that he could be there for his children and allow his children to be there for them without feeling threatened or misled or misguided. He will forever hold a special place in my heart because we've had 3 encounters, 2 as an RN and 1 as an NP student, and it's really interesting to see and realize how important those documents are. When a patient's in a situation like that, as an ER nurse, you just look for the emergency contact and you try to get a hold of them. And then at least our system kind of flags us if there's an advance directive on file, which the system didn't because there wasn't one. So we just called the emergency contact and gave that information to Madison so that they knew, hey, this is who we have as emergency contact, you need to call. But how much of an impact that actually had on this patient's life, on his wishes, on his hopes and his dreams, how much her thoughts were not in line with his, and how important it was for him that his daughter was to take over for his medical decision making. A very, very, very emotional conversation, but I'm really glad that we had it. I'm really glad he brought it up. It would be a heck of a lot easier, or was a lot easier for him to bring up this conversation with this background than it was for me to just say, hey, you haven't had an advance direct. That conversation, I think, would have been a little more awkward in comparison to him coming in, knowing what he wants, knowing what he needs, and having that recent event. He was very, very motivated to make sure that everything was taken care of so that his children had everything that they needed. His wife was going to be in a safe place with what she needed, and that his wishes were honored. So with that being said, I am going to conclude my portion of the 703 portfolio project on my 86-year-old patient transitional of care visit that then turned into so much more. So I hope everybody else had a really great experience with this. I know I did. I know that the importance of it is now forever ingrained in my head, just seeing what kind of impact it can have on the family and the patient. And I will be bringing this up at all of my Medicare wellness visits, indeed. But I might even start earlier as far as just annual wellness visits for any age group, because you never know what kind of underlying things are affecting a family's function or dysfunction until a tragic event happens, and then it's almost too late, or you don't want it to be too late to step back and fix it. So you want that stuff in line ahead of time. So thank you very much for watching. I'm sorry I went a smidgen over what I was supposed to, but such an interesting case, such a great perspective, and I cannot wait to see ID again. Hopefully not in the emergency room. Hopefully it's a clinic visit. But nonetheless, I'm really happy with how this one turned out. And although it was very difficult and very heartbreaking, I do think it was best overall for the patient and the family. And I know he's resting easy knowing that that's taken care of. So thank you.